Hello and welcome to Comic Book Cache. I'm Grant, and today I thought it might be interesting to take a look through one of Kevin Smith's earlier comic books, Clerks, the comic book, published by Oni Press in 2001. This predates Kevin's work with Marvel Knights and all the Batman stuff he did much later. This is his independent book that pretty much centers on the View Askew universe, which is Kevin Smith's Jay and Silent Bob universe, I guess you could call it these days. But this was this particular book was made. I think it was after Chasing Amy and pre-Dogma, so he'd done 3 films at this stage. His universe was well and truly set, so he has a lot of characters that he can play with at this stage. So this is my copy of the book. Mine's signed by Jason Mewes. Picked it up from the Secret Stash in Jersey many years ago. Well, I suppose we should start with the cover. The cover is actually by Gilbert Hernandez, indie legend, famous for Love and Rockets and such books. And he actually did one of my all-time favorite books, Sloth. It's definitely a great book. If you can find it, check it out. Gilbert Hernandez. Apologies. Colors are done by Laura Allred, another well-known comic book person. The fact that it's done by Gilbert Hernandez makes me wonder why he did it. For him, I guess it was probably just another paycheck, but for Kevin, I think he was trying to clout his indie side of things. Back when he made Clerks and Chasing Amy, he was still considered an indie filmmaker. Sort of that gritty, grungy, not a part of the studio system, but outside the studio system, doing something that wasn't quite so mainstream. And I think he wanted to try and do the same thing with his comics. Like I said, this is pre-Marvel Knights, so he hadn't worked for Marvel or DC at this stage. So I think he was really relying on the indie stuff, and we'll see a few more examples of this throughout the book. So we'll open it up, title page. It's created and written by Kevin Smith, illustrated by Jim Mahfood. I presume that's pronounced correctly. I actually haven't heard of him. I'm not sure what he went on to do after or what he did before this, but I actually quite like his art, and it's very well suited for a Clerks tale. The only other thing worth mentioning maybe is you've got your normal View Askew credits, and then down with producers, we've got Jason Mewes, Brian Quinn, Walt Flanagan, Brian Johnson. The one name I should mention is Brian Quinn, Q from the Impractical Jokers, who famously worked for View Askew before his comedy career took off. And this is another example of one of the things that he probably helped put together back when he was working for Kevin Smith. So the story begins with a couple of lesser known Kevin Smith characters, Steve, Dave, and Walt. I think he's Walt in the movies as well, who in this book own and run a comic book store or a pop culture store of some sort, much akin to how Walt actually runs the Secret Stash for Kevin Smith these days. And Steve Dave is a character based on Kevin Smith's longtime friend, Brian Johnson. So we begin with them, and then we're introduced pretty quickly. We don't actually see the reveal until a couple of pages in of Randall, who is one half of the Clerks. And we'll notice actually on this second page, this is inside their comic book store. There's a bookcase with presumably comic books for sale, and on there we can see Hellboy, 8-Ball, what else is there that I would know? Optic Nerve, Too Much Coffee Man. These are pretty well-known indie books as well. So instead of going presumably it's probably for licensing reasons, he didn't go for Marvel or DC, but Kevin and all the artists decided to put in some indie books instead, which is interesting. So we're still continuing on. There's not too much here in the story. We get our reveal of Randall and the Quick Stop and RST, 2 well-known locations within Kevin Smith's universes. Not too much happening at this stage. We haven't set up the main plot or anything yet. It's just Randall doing his normal Randall thing with customers. We can see Jay and Silent Bob make their appearance. They actually don't appear too much in the book. They do have a plot point later on, but they actually don't do too much. And then we're introduced to Dante, the other half of the Clerks. And they go on to do their normal clerk conversations. If you've seen Clerks or perhaps Clerks 2, it's pretty much in the same vein as that. There's a lot of dialogue. Kevin Smith writes a lot of dialogue. You can see here, he manages to fit so many words into word balloons. That's Kevin Smith. He's a writer. He likes to write. It's not until much later does he realize he can put less words into a comic book and still get the same effect. But at this stage, we'll forgive him because this is one of his first comic books and it's Kevin Smith, and that's kind of what you expect, is a very wordy sort of book. We're still traveling along. There's not too much happening in the plot. I think at this stage, about here is where Dante and Randall, or Randall in particular, hatches his plan, his little entrepreneurial plan to make some money off some Star Wars figures. Actually, previously, back here, we do have a conversation. Oh no, maybe a little bit later on, when we get to it. Yeah, it's about here. So they have a conversation about the effect of Star Wars, whether or not it's still valid. And I like this line from Dante here. Trust me, after the overexposure of the re-release, no one but you gives a rat's ass about your precious trilogy anymore. That's actually in reference to, this predates Star Wars Episode 1, Phantom Menace, so there was a fair bit of Star Wars hype at the time, but you could still apply that today to all the re-release and new release Star Wars movies. Interesting that Dante's seems to have all but given up on Star Wars. A lot of Star Wars references, just some normal Clerks jokes. The plot goes further along. They decide they're going to resell all the Star Wars figures that are being released. They plan to buy them from the Toys R Us type store, sell them to a bunch of nerds. The plan doesn't go quite that well when they find out that they're actually all sold out, so they have to think of a different way. I guess that probably happened. I don't really remember that happening when the Star Wars films came out, but you could definitely apply that today with pop vinyls or any sort of limited availability. They do mention in here quite a lot that people go looking for chase figures, the different waves that are released, so on and so on. But that particularly applies to toys. Just more Clerk stuff going on. They meet the guy who's not quite yet. They will eventually meet the guy who's in charge of the reselling business, which is here. He's some nerd who works at Toys R Us, seems to have the inside track on how to get all the Star Wars figures, and he commands quite a presence because people come to him to buy their toys that they wish to resell. And so Dante and Randall have to fall in line with him and his wishes. It's actually not too bad of a plot. I think it's a pretty simple story, but Kevin does make it work. A lot of the jokes within the book are actually reused jokes, I find, from Clerks and Clerks 2, but I guess in that sort of scenario or theme, there's only so much you can do with Clerks and their customers. So he does try to broaden it a bit by taking it out of the store, but in the end it still seems to be some of the same old fart and dick jokes that Kevin Smith's well known for. Same plot, Joe and Silent Bob come back into it. They start to get upset that people are buying toys instead of their drugs, so they hatch a plan to bring it all down. And that's pretty much the entire plot. By the end of the movie, in the comic, Jay and Silent Bob have hijacked all the toys and are pretty much giving them away, which in turn crashes the whole market. So at this point should probably bring us some of the art by Jim Mahfood. I think it works really well with the Kevin Smith book. It's obviously black and white. Clerks was in black and white. Indie books are black and white, so that whole thing comes together really well for this book. Very heavy on the inks, which I think works really well, but it's still this sort of cartoony style faces you can see. I quite like them. I think they work really well for Kevin Smith's books. You can easily identify which characters are which. There's no distinguishing between characters. No, not distinguishing between characters. One thing I will notice there is a severe lack of female characters, as well as just any other characters that aren't part of his Little View Askew universe. He could have maybe somehow introduced a few new characters, a few female characters, but I think he was just going to play it safe and use the ones that everyone knows and loves. And that's about it. Come to the end, Dante and Randall get their comeuppance. They come out on top, and that's pretty much the end of the story. We've got an ad here for some more Kevin Smith books. At this stage, he was starting to really get stuck into comic books as a writer. He released several more books under his own View Askew universe, including this one. I believe it's this one that serves as a tie-in between Dogma and Jay and Silent Bob. Here it is. From Chasing Amy to The Doorstep of Dogma. So it links those two movies together using a comic book, which is pretty clever. It's a clever thing for Kevin Smith to do. He is a comic book guy, so he knew what he was doing there. I don't know if it really sold that many or appealed to anyone outside of Kevin Smith's usual fans, but it was good to see that even though he went on to do mainstream stuff, Kevin has a genuine love for comic books, or he did at the time. And he gave this a good crack. So that's Clerks, the comic book. Thanks for watching.